All right, Second Kings 5 is mentioned in the New Testament, in the life of Christ. And so I'll probably get into that a little more next week, but we're going to split Second Kings 5 into the first 14 verses and then the last half. So just the first 14 verses today. And as you start reading Second Kings 5, we get there's this great man who has a lot of high favor, and we'll see the amount of wealth that he takes with him. I did a little bit of math. It is over $1 million worth of wealth that he takes as a present for whoever can heal him of his leprosy. So having that amount of money, like how much of us should if you go to the doctor and say, Doc, I'll give you $1 million if you can heal me. Like, okay. Only a few people in society could have that kind of wealth, but given his position, we would expect him to have this kind of wealth. But God's desire is for all men that they would repent and cry out to him for salvation. And Jesus said in Luke 18:24 to 27, before the Zacchaeus story, that it is extremely hard for wealthy, mighty people to come to him as Savior. Okay. So this guy, and there's a few other mighty, wealthy people in the Old Testament that come to God, probably Nebuchadnezzar, several kings like David, Solomon, but they are few and far between in the life of Christ. They are also few and far between in today. They are few and far between. But uh, Jesus said, with man, this is impossible. With God, all things are possible. And then he tells the story of Zacchaeus, is right after that. It's hard for wealthy people, and Zacchaeus is a wealthy person, and he comes to know Christ because Christ came to seek and to save those who are lost. So here's a man who is definitely spiritually lost. And so how this is designed, I think, set up the first half of the chapter deals with his physical problem. The second half deals with the spiritual problem. So that's why I'll divide it into the first 14 verses to deal with the physical problem. But anytime we have physical issues, it those physical issues are meant for us to cry out to the Lord, and we grow spiritually through physical struggles. Okay. Here is a man who has all this wealth, position, as high as ranking as a person as he could possibly get without being king. And yet he's got this physical issue, and God uses that physical issue to draw him to himself. So God has to humble him, and there's a series of steps of humbling that this guy goes through to bring him to finally, we would say, bring him to his knees. Okay, to do exactly what God wanted him to do, to be healed of leprosy, but ultimately to bring him to, I think, salvation. So most of the people that God calls and redeems are poor, they're weak, they're simple. First Corinthians tells us that. However, there are a few wealthy, powerful, brilliant people that come to God and Christ for salvation. Second Kings 5 is a story of the latter. So how, and I would say who, does God use to bring this mighty man to himself? So verses 1 to 8, God brings this mighty man from a comfortable position of pride to weak dependence. All right, so let's look at verse 1. Naaman, the commander of the army of the king of Syria. As soon as we hear Syria, what we have read up to this point, Syria was the common enemy of the north of Israel. When Ahab is king, when his son now is one of his sons is king, we're not told the name, so we're guessing one of his sons is king here during Elisha's serving as prophet. So during this time, the Syrians are the common enemy, kind of like the Philistines were with David and King Saul. The Syrians are common enemies just to the north, and they are constantly fighting Israel. In fact, it says here in our passage, he is the commander of the army of the king of Syria. He was a great man with his master and in high favor. And now we have a little bit here that Naaman probably doesn't understand until after he is spiritually right with God. But because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria, God is using Syria to judge Israel, Ahab and his sons. And this man is a recipient, an instrument and a recipient of the wealth that is gained from being the head of the army who God is using to judge Israel. He was a mighty man of valor, okay? But he was a leper. Now, there are several skin diseases. You can read Leviticus 13 and 14 about whether or not skin diseases were temporary or permanent. It sounds like in this story, this was a permanent skin disease, and it caused him to be very concerned about his health. And so, verse 2 now the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel. So they captured hostage, and he, being a leader, could, if he wasn't the one who captured this little girl, he purchased her as a slave, likely. And so she is now in his house and serving his wife. She worked in the service of Naaman's wife. And she says to her mistress, "Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." Now, we don't know this little girl's name, but I'm going to assume that she's not an idol worshiper who has been captured, because if she was, like the most of the rest of Israel, she would say, "Oh, you guys are serving Baal here, but we serve Baal in Israel. Why don't you go to Israel to serve Baal?" Okay. She says, "You need to go to the prophet who only God can heal you of your leprosy." So she likely is a God-fearing little girl, and we don't know how old she is, other than it says she's a little girl. She could have said, "Well, I don't like my master because he ripped me out of my homeland and away from it, and I'm just going to let him die from this." But she has a love for her, or respect for her master, um, and he may have treated her well. Her mistress may have treated her well, uh, and so she's concerned, and she's got some love and care for her master. But if you were in Naaman's situation, you have a slave in your house, you don't listen to your slaves, they listen to you. Okay. This is the first step of how God's going to use servants in this passage and Naaman has to listen to servant after servant after servant in order to God bring him to his knees. Okay. So this is the first servant. There's three servants. This is the first servant that Naaman has to listen to be humbled under God. So the first servant is from Israel. She knows about the prophet and says, "There's a prophet in Israel." And Naaman's familiar with Israel because he had gone in there with as the head of the army and raiding and carrying off captives. She's one of those captives. And said, "If you could get to the prophet who's in Samaria," verse 3, "he would cure him of his leprosy." She's got faith. And so Naaman goes in and tells his Lord. So he's talking now to the king of Syria. "Thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel." And the king of Syria says, so kings aren't given names here. They're not really important, because actually what the two kings of Israel say aren't true. So, or their ideas of how to cure Naaman, that's not how it works. Okay. So these guys are just there, but they're not important. The servants are important. Okay. And it all focuses on Naaman. We understand he's the main character here. So he goes to his king, the king of Syria, and the king of Syria says, "Okay, if you're going to go to Israel, I'm going to send a letter to the king of Israel." He doesn't say, "I'm going to send a letter to the prophet." Okay. He's thinking, "I'm going to send you to the letter of the king of Israel." Likely Syria is more powerful than Israel at this time. And so Israel may be serving Syria. So this is another way for Israel to serve Syria by, "Hey, can you help the commander get healed?" So physical weakness causes us to need God's might too. So he's going from a position of comfort, and if you can put yourself in his position, he is very proud. He's in control. He has a position, he has influence, he has wealth, he has all these resources around him. But physically, he's got this problem. And this physical weakness causes him to need God. So he goes to his king who doesn't know God. And the king is going to send him to another king who doesn't know God. But eventually he's going to get to someone who the servant girl said, you got to get to the prophet. Don't go to Israel and just anyone. You got to go to the prophet. Why? Because the prophet is going to be your connection to God. You need God to heal you. Okay, is what his servant told him. He had to listen. So you'll see three times in this section that when he goes, or it says here, so he went. When he makes a decision to go, that is, he's exercising faith. Okay, he's leaving comfort and he's going to somewhere is uncomfortable. So if you have a health issue and your spouse or your friend says you need to go to the doctor, you're like, no, okay, and you give excuses, and you're not getting better, and eventually you go, okay, that's showing humility, all right, and so for him to get healed, he has to humble himself, and he has to listen to his servant, not necessarily the king. The king says, I'm going to write a letter. This is going to help you. Actually, the letter doesn't do anything. Okay. But he goes. And let's see in verse 5 what his plan is. Okay. I'm going to go. I'm going to get healed. And when I get healed, I'm going to pay for this healing. I'm going to pay 10 talents of silver. A talent of silver in today's money is about $36,000 each. Okay. And then 6,000 shekels of gold, and that's over $1 million of gold that he has in today's money, and 10 changes of clothes. And think of very wealthy clothes and a change of clothes. Remember Samson and the Philistines, he got 30 changed away. So wealthy people's clothes. And so he thinks he's going to buy his healing. Okay. Verse 6. And he brought the letter. So he's got these resources, plus he's got a letter from the king of Syria to the king of Israel, which read, when this letter reaches you, and this is from Syria to the king of Israel, know that I have sent to you Naaman, my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy. So one not God-fearing king sends a letter to a other non-God-fearing king, expecting the second king is going to be able to heal him of his leprosy. In verse 7, and when the king of Israel read the letter, now you imagine these guys, the king of Israel has lost over and over again to the king of Syria and is lost in battle to Naaman, the commander of the army. When the king of Israel reads this letter, he tears his clothes and says, am I God to kill and to make alive? That phrase is from two places in the Old Testament. One is Deuteronomy 32:29 in the Song of Moses, and it's also referred to in when God answers Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel 2, and Hannah quotes it as well. And so it's two other times this king of Israel, we're not given his name, probably one of the sons of Ahab. He knows enough of Deuteronomy 32 or Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel 2:6 to say, am I God? Only God can make someone who is on his path to death, has a terminal illness, only God can make this person alive. And I'm not him. Okay. That's good. But he doesn't, the king of Israel, is not pointing people toward the prophet like the little slave girl was. Okay. That was her advice. Go to Israel because that's where the prophet is. And the prophet's going to be your connection to God, who's going to be able to heal you. The king of Syria doesn't know that. The king of Israel doesn't know that. And so let's see what happens. And so there's this thought that the king of Israel has. He says, okay, am I God to kill and to make alive that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? I can't do this. Only consider, here's why he sent his commander of his army to me, to see how he is seeking a quarrel with me. Okay, he's trying to flaunt his military might. He's trying to test me. He's trying to quarrel. That's not what's happening. But the king of Israel gets it wrong. The king of Syria gets it wrong. Naaman is still kind of getting it wrong. But verse 8, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, it was a sign of humility. And him quoting the Old Testament, sign of humility. He comes to wrong conclusions though. He's confused. He's though in despair. And so Elisha sends and says to him, "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me." Now, this is fascinating what he says at the end of verse 8, that he may know. Now, when Ahab was helped a couple times in battle, one of the prophets said to Ahab, "I'm going to help you so that you would know that there is a God in Israel. His name's the Lord." Okay. But this benefit of how God's going to heal Naaman is not going to benefit the king of Israel. For who is the recipient of this knowledge? It's going to be he, that's Naaman. That he, Naaman, may know that there is a prophet in Israel. Okay. The king doesn't say, "I can't do this, but you need to go to the prophet in Israel," because the king doesn't recognize Elisha as the prophet of who could heal lepers. And we get that from Jesus' analogy of this that we'll see next week. So for now, this man is going from a comfortable position of pride and control and influence and wealth. He brings his wealth with him, and he is now standing before a king that is causing him to be, he doesn't have control over this king. This is not his king. He doesn't have influence. He doesn't have position. He still has his wealth. Okay. But God's using this to humble the king of Israel. That's why we see in him tearing his clothes. And the benefit is not going to be for the king of Israel. It's going to be for Naaman. And the benefit is that he would know that there is a prophet in Israel and that there is a God who alone can heal him. All right, so this is bringing the mighty man from a comfortable pride to weak dependence. He's got to listen. So Elisha sends and says, "Send him to me." Elisha doesn't go. Okay, he's sent to the king, so he doesn't go by himself. Verse 9. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots. He's got this huge entourage, right? And stands at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, a servant, saying, "Hey, go. Here's what the prophet says. Whenever someone great comes, you don't send your servant to talk to him. You go yourself." But God is using all the circumstances here to humble Naaman, humble Naaman. He's got to listen to his little servant girl that he captured. Now he's got to listen to Elisha's prophet or Elisha's servant. Not even Elisha comes to the door and sends and says, "Okay, this is what God's man says to you." And he's not even, no, Elisha doesn't even come himself. He says, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." How simple is that? And if Elisha says that to his servant, that's it? Yeah, that's all you got to tell him. Okay, I can remember that. And so he goes, he tells Naaman can clearly get that. I go to the Jordan, I wash 7 times, I'm going to be healed. Okay. All right. A very simple instruction. Is there anything magical about the Jordan? They're not like the pool of Bethesda in Jesus. It wasn't like a place where all the lepers go to get cleansed in Jordan. No, this is a very precise thing that's going to test Naaman's faith and see if he's humble enough to do this simple task. And the answer at first is no, he's not humble enough yet. Verse 11. But Naaman was angry. And anger is almost like drunkenness. It confuses us. We don't make rash decisions when we make rash decisions when we're angry. We don't make wise, well thought out, logical decisions when we are angry. So Naaman was angry and he goes away. And he says, "Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper." And then he continues his rant and says, "Are not Arbana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel?" He's in his pride, still needs to be humbled. "Could I not wash in them and be clean?" And he turns away and goes away, and he's still angry, in a rage. All right, so he rants. Did it do him any good? No, it didn't do him any good. All it reveals is he is not humble enough to listen to God's simple instruction. And he's thinking, we are better than Israel. We have conquered Israel. I've got a slave from Israel, but I had to listen to that slave girl if he's thinking. I come to the king of Israel. He can't do anything. And now the prophet who my slave girl told me I had to talk to, he doesn't even come to me. He doesn't do what I thought he should do. Here is a man who thinks he's in control. Well, he's in control of an army, but he can't cure himself. He needs to be humbled under God. Only God can cure him. All right. And so there's this need for God's man to reach out, and God's man, the prophet, reaches out in verse 8. Then there's a need for to speak to God's man's servant only with a humbling, faith-building task. That's verses 9 and 10. Then in verses 11 and 12 we just read, there's this need to submit to the humbling, faith-building task. And what does he have to turn from? Selfish, angry thoughts. You get the selfish anger in verse 11, 12 when he thinks, we are better than, my rivers are better than the Jordan. Our people are better than Israel. Well, you would expect this of a powerful commander of the army. But that's not going to help him. He's got to submit to God for God to heal him. Now, verses 13 and 14. What does God use to finally bring Naaman out of his rage and to his senses and to his knees before God? Verse 13. But his servants came near, and his servants said to him, my father. It is a great word, or another translation is probably a little bit better that says, if they ask you to do something great, if the prophet asks you to do something great, to do something would be added into the Hebrew to make it a little more, make it sense. This actually doesn't, ESV doesn't make sense in the context, but the New American Standard, I think the King James also say, if they ask you to do something great, would you not do it? And obviously the answer was, if you asked you to go conquer some land or conquer a city, you would say, yeah, let's go get him, let's conquer it, then we'll get healed. But that's not what God asked you to do. What did God ask you to do? Has he actually said to you, just wash and be clean? So if God asked you to do something great and powerful, you would say, yes, that is what I expected. Or his expectation was God to come and wave his hand and perform some elaborate miracle. This is how I expected God to work for me. God doesn't work for us in how we want him to work for us. He works for us in a way that brings us to dependence. So there is no logical explanation. And the only reason we get healing is we relied on the Lord. And that's what he has to come to this conclusion. And so he has to listen to the third servant now. He goes from a comfortable position in Syria to humble himself to go to Israel. Then he goes from the king of Israel to talk to a man of God's servant. And then he's got to listen to that servant to go to the bank of the Jordan River. And from the Jordan River, he's got to listen to his servants to actually go into the river and do exactly what God said. So now he's listened to this third set of servants here, and his servants talk him out of doing something rash, like going back and not be healed. Just go do something simple, like wash and be clean. How simple is that? So verse 14, so he went down. Okay, he finally is humble enough to do exactly what God said. He goes down, dips himself, kind of think of like a baptism where he goes down, immerses himself 7 times. Now, this wasn't gradual. It wasn't like after 1, 2, 3, he's starting to see a little less and less. No, he probably has all of his leprosy after 6 times. This is how God has worked with Elijah and Elisha. It is nothing to everything, like the raising of these boys from the dead. This is not, oh, I see it working. No, it requires, what did God say? 7 times. If he tries 6, like, that's it, I'm done. His servants were like, 7. Okay, 7 times is what God said. Just do what God said. Okay. And finally he submits. He does the 7 times. And the story is exciting here. And his flesh, according to the word of the man of God, he dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. So the need here is to listen to a humbling, logical servant, and then he finally and fully submitted, and he was healed physically. Okay, this is where we're going to stop today. This is the first half of the story. The second half includes several responses and some long-term consequences, good and bad consequences. But we will also see evidence of a great healing, more powerful than the healing from this physical leprosy. But for now, we can rejoice in the providence of God to humble the mightiest of men in order to bring them to himself. So, how does this affect our praying? If we take this story and say, this is how God, we don't have people with leprosy, we don't have a prophet, right? But what can we learn from this story and apply it in our prayer time? God controls all of the details of this story, okay? To bring the mightiest of men to his knees spiritually and to himself. So if this is how God operates, then today we are going to pray for people that are extremely proud, and we want God to humble them. And God may be using, and people are all along the way in this story that God brings to talk to and encourage proud people to be humble and listen to God. Do exactly what God says. Submit to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And for this, it took three different, and he went, and he went, and he went down into, okay? So three different times he had to decide, am I going to do this? Okay, yeah, I'll try it. Okay, yeah, I'll try it. Okay, yeah, I'll get into the Jordan River. Three different times, and at three different junctures, junctions, he had to listen to servants. And here we are as servants of God. And we are going to reach out to people that are proud and mighty and self-sufficient, leading. And we can't avoid people that are proud and self-sufficient and leaders in our study. God may be drawing them, and he may be using you and I as nameless servants in their story to bring them to himself.